Has this ever bothered you? Have you ever wondered why bad things happen to innocent people? It's a question that humans have asked since ancient times. Why does one person live and another person die? How can a just God allow such injustice? The book of Job is an ancient work of poetry in our Bibles that wrestles with this sort of question. Specifically, is a person's faith in God directly connected to how well God treats you, or vice versa? If someone is wealthy and powerful, is that a reliable sign of God's blessings? Throughout history, kings and leaders have often used that argument to justify their power. I'm your king because God made me your king. But in the book of Job, we see something different from that. A poetic book, a mix of dialogue and monologues, so it can be a little hard to follow. But the book of Job suggests something very different from what we would have been considered the traditional belief, particularly at that time, about why good or innocent people suffer. It's a question that all of us will likely ask at some point in our lives. When we see bad things happen to good people, we wonder, how could a loving God allow that? Or on the flip side, we might wonder how God will allow a terrible person to be so rich and powerful. Because we've too often seen people become wealthy due to dishonesty, violence, or exploitation. Yet we still look up to the wealthy, even take part in the belief that the wealthy are blessed by God, despite evidence otherwise. Partially because it is a message that's found in our Bibles, that faithfulness will lead to prosperity, and there is some truth to that. But as a counterpoint to this, also in our Bibles, is the message that God cares more for the poor and the oppressed. Or as Jesus puts it, it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. So, which view would you say is most prevalent today? Do we still assume the rich are blessed? Do we still blame the poor for being poor? Do we blame the sick for being sick? The story of Job offers a counterpoint, almost a rebuttal to that simplistic view. And it's mostly in the form of ancient poetry. So it's important to remember that when we read the book of Job, that in poetry, we don't expect scientific literalism. We don't expect history. We expect art and image, rhyme and rhythm with a message. And as often happens, though, when poetry is translated into another language, much of the original appeal, much of the original poetry gets lost. When we look at the book of Job, notice that the beginning and the end of the book are written in narrative form, as shown here on the left, while most of the story is written in the form of poetry, as shown in the right. The translators formatted it this way on purpose to try to communicate to the reader that the original writing is art, is poetry, because we can miss that, easily miss that. So we have this ancient poem that was embellished with a short beginning and ending to provide an introduction and a little bit of a conclusion to interpret the original poem. The introduction and conclusion frame the poem and provide context. And it tells us that the story itself takes place outside of Israel. This is likely a pagan poem that was adopted by the Jewish people. Job is not a typical Jewish name. And the text introduces Job as being from the land of Uz. U-Z it's spelled. That's not Israel. And Job's friends are people from outside of Israel too. Yet this poem was adopted and modified for a Jewish context, likely during the Babylonian captivity, if you remember that, the captivity of the Jewish people about 500 years before Christ was born. The section of Job that reads as a poem is ancient in origin, significantly predating the time when the narrative parts of the beginning were added. So what's this story or this poem about? Like I said, it's poetry. We need to be careful with how literally we take the story. But the story of Job starts out with an explanation that Job was a good man. Oh, he followed all of God's teachings. And being a good man, he was, of course, rich and powerful, wealthy. He had a large, prosperous family, thousands of sheep, camels, servants. He was considered one of the greatest people of the East. And boy, was he a faithful man. Job is so faithful that God holds him up. Hey, check this guy out. Now there's a faithful man, God says. In the story, God boasts about Job to a group of his heavenly beings, really kind of members of God's royal court, if you will. And one of these court members was the court prosecutor. However, in translation, in our version of the Bible, the name for the prosecutor is translated into the English word Satan. And this can be a little confusing, since the Satan, as translated in this poem, would not have been the devil or Satan as we picture it today. To the original audience, this being, this person was a prosecutor, the accuser, someone who worked for God the judge. So Satan in this story is more like a lawyer or a magistrate than an opponent of God. And in the story, Satan, as the prosecutor, argues, hey, the only reason Job is faithful to you, God, is because you've blessed him. You've blessed him with wealth and power. Who wouldn't be faithful? The prosecutor argues that the faith is that's just typical human behavior. That's typical human faith. It's shallow faith. Easy to falter. So the prosecutor suggests a test. He says, if Job was to lose everything, he's going to curse you to your face, God. He's going to lose his faith. And Job says, I don't think so. God says, I don't, and agrees to this test. And the way the test is carried out, we're told, is that God removes God's protective hand from all that Job has, although God's protective hand remains on Job himself, that he would remain healthy and wise. And then disasters start to occur. Job loses his family, his property, and a series of natural disasters and military attacks. But Job does not lose faith. Job says, naked, I came to the world naked from my mom's womb, and I shall return as such. Or he also said, the common saying, he says, the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Have you ever heard that? That's Job. So God reports Job's faithfulness to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor is not impressed. He says, come on. The only reason Job is faithful, the only reason Job trusts God is because he's still healthy. He's still got that. But if Job was to lose his health, the prosecutor suggests he's going to lose his faith for sure. So next, Job is inflicted with sores from head to foot, but he remains faithful. Job then is visited by three friends. And this is actually, everything up to now has been the narrative. We're not even to the poetry yet. This is where the poetry starts, when the three friends show up. So a good part of the story is laid by this added narrative. And the whole section of the prosecutor and God was likely added to the poem so that to the most ancient parts of this story, to make it more suitable for the Jewish audience, the ancient Jewish audience. Job's friends grieve with Job in this poem, who's so disfigured they can barely recognize who he is. And then the poetic exchange between Job and his friends and God make up most of the story. Job's friends try to convince Job that the problem is him. It's got to be you, Job. I mean, it can't be God. God is perfect. You just need to repent. So these well-meaning friends are sure that Job must be guilty of some sin. Or maybe it's his family who were guilty. But Job, no, he's not having any of this. He defends his innocence. and boldly objects to the injustices of a situation, both to his friends and to God. And finally, God appears to Job in a whirlwind, in a tornado, and Job has got questions. Job wants to know, God, why are you doing this? Why are you so unfair? God does not answer Job's questions. God responds with other questions. So God basically says, hey, where were you when I created the heaven and the earth? A response that conveys that Job doesn't even know enough to ask the question. He doesn't understand. He doesn't have enough perspective to even ask the questions he's asking. And then God responds to Job's friends, chastising them for their simple theological understandings, although common, and how they blamed Job when it wasn't Job's fault. Job's friends, whose advice to Job had reflected the conventional wisdom of the time, and maybe some of the wisdom of our time too, are instructed to seek Job's forgiveness and prayers in order to be spared God's wrath. And finally, Job prays for his friends, and God restores Job with twice as much as what he had before, and we're told that Job lived a long and blessed life, and thus ends the story. Now, the classic Christian interpretation of the book of Job is about patience and faith in the face of death, destruction, and disease. And that's important, but it's also a simplification of the many dimensions of this story. One overarching message I take away from this story of Job is how it reminds us, as God reminded Job, that our ability to perceive justice is inherently limited, particularly with regard to the suffering of innocents. And the story brings many interesting questions to light. First, why does anyone revere God? Why does anyone have faith in God to begin with? Do we honor God in a bargain for security and well-being? Hey, God will have faith in you if you are good to me. Or is our relationship with God independent of our circumstances, as somewhat displayed by Job? Traditional Christianity often talks about the blessings and riches that come from piety and obedience to God. But I wonder if expectations like that, expectations of rewards like that, corrupt our faith by introducing the selfish element in what is intended to be a selfless relationship. Job's selfless piety is unshaken, even by extreme misfortune, revealing the possibility that even humans can love God deeply without condition. That's a possibility for us. Job's friends in this story were providing him with traditional instruction of the time of what a person experiencing suffering should do. His friends basically are saying, you must be sinning, and then they suggest that suffering depends upon where you're at in life. This was the friends' wisdom. The friends said that if you're wicked, then suffering is about judgment. If you're morally unsteady, the friends said, then suffering is a warning. If you're immature, morally immature, then suffering is a form of education. So the assumption of Job's friends is that God is always right, and that it's the human being who must make use of the experience of suffering to learn what God is trying to communicate. That suffering is somehow God trying to communicate to us. Job's stance towards God, however, represents a far less traditional and more dynamic divine human relationship. Rather than turn inward, as suggested by his friend, Job demands an explanation from God. He wrestles verbally with God. God, what are you doing? Stop that. Job demonstrates that when our suffering appears to be undeserved, it's okay to be upset by that. Job rejects the idea of unquestioned piety and engages God in communication that goes both ways. And throughout this exchange between Job and his friends, there's this consistent pattern of the friends offering a traditional, logical, common sense view of things that often looks a lot like how we see things today. And Job offers an alternative view. The friends rely on religious tradition, while Job is relying on his experience of God, and he frames and rejects the traditional wisdom. But all the while, even though Job challenges traditional understandings in regard to suffering, he does remain faithful throughout the story. We like to think of Job as an example of patient faithfulness, and he was. But he was not always so patient. He was actually a rebel in some ways, who used his own experience to poke holes in the ideas of his time about how a loving God could allow suffering. In the end of the story, God rejects the traditional assumptions. He says, oh, all the common sense assumptions about suffering you guys offered, nope, that's wrong. But he says Job is more right. Job the rebel, the rejecter of traditional explanations. It's Job who's spoken right. It's Job who wrestled with God. Another important lesson from this story of Job is don't be quick to judge someone based primarily on their level of suffering or their low status in life. In the New Testament, Jesus takes the idea a step further. Jesus says that when you do kindness to those who suffer, you do kindness to Jesus himself. All right, that's very different from blaming someone who suffers, which is the traditional approach, unfortunately. Jesus demonstrates something well beyond being non-judgmental to being in solidarity with those who suffer. That maybe when we suffer, somehow God suffers too. And finally, I think the book of Job also suggests that our tendency to want to come up with nice, neat, theological explanations for our suffering are going to always be problematic. Sure, sometimes our suffering is due to our own poor choices. It is sometimes, right? And we need to own up to that. We need to own that. When we make a bad choice and the natural result is bad things, let's not be blaming God for that. So we need to consider the situation. And if the problem is your decisions and your actions, then the only way out is to change them. And know that you're allowed to talk or even argue with God and with others along the way. Whichever way, whether you caused your suffering or whether you were totally innocent. In the book of Job, we see a model for dealing with suffering in which Job examines his situation, he prays, he meditates, he asks questions, and he talks to his friends. Now, when Job confronted God, God did not actually give Job a direct answer. Instead, God responded to Job's questions with more questions. God could have said, we're just testing you, but there's more going on here than that. That's not the lesson of the story. And I think God in the book of Job basically gives us two answers to the question of suffering. Both of them that maybe we can use ourselves in difficult times. And the first answer is to take a step back, to look at our place in the universe and remember that we're just a small part of a huge complex system. Very little revolves around us individually. And to be able to hold that in tension with the fact that we're infinitely important, both at the same time. And we need to be careful when we do this, particularly when we remember that the universe is big and we are small, a small boat in a big sea, that doesn't need to be demeaning. Ideally, it's freeing and humbling to accept the awesome nature of reality, that everything really doesn't depend on us. That answer, one of perspective, can help restore our relationship with the world when we are suffering, when we hurt. It's part of the grieving process. It's a huge part of healing after a tragedy or an extreme difficulty. And the second answer is just as important. There's more to God in life than we understand. It's not supposed to be easy to answer life's mysteries. We're not supposed to have easy answers to life's difficult questions. And it's so easy for the church to just tell you that it is. Everything's clear. It's black and white. I think Job would disagree. I think God disagrees. We're supposed to struggle with these things. It's part of the journey of living. We're called to keep growing, to keep demanding answers, to keep wrestling with each other and with God. Perhaps that's why maybe this ancient story of Job has found its way into our Bible and has held such a special place in so many of our hearts to this day.